We now welcome Philippe Marlière, who comes to us from French and European politics.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm going to talk about the question of race in the so-called colorblind French Republic. Colorblind because, of course, that's officially in France, race is a non-topic, something the state doesn't want to look into. And so let's see how it goes. I think clearly a way of summarizing a difference between the situation prevailing in France and Britain is to say, on the one hand, when it comes to defining citizenship and rights associated with citizenship in France, one talks about nationality. Nationality is the key thing. Whereas in Britain it is race. Race, of course, is officially, legally acknowledged, and the state, of course, grounds certain provisions to individuals on the grounds of ethnic background. A fairly well-known, I believe, statement made by Count Clermont-Tonnerre, an aristocrat who supported the revolution. At the time of granting French citizenship to the Jews in France, this is what he had to say about the whole process and why the Jews should become French citizens. Deny everything to the Jews as a nation and deny nothing to them as individuals. Well, what it means, it's pretty clear. It means that we are granting citizenship to Jews on the grounds, not on the grounds of their ethnic, religious background, because they come from a certain community, but we grant them those rights because they are simply individuals, and as such, they should be French. So I think the key thing to remember, and of course I can't do justice to a broad and complex subject, but it's to say that in fact in France, French citizenship makes no distinction on ethno-racial lines in the public sphere. You know, it isn't for the state to know about the ethnic or racial background of his or her citizens. The assumption is that within the public sphere, individuals, citizenship will flourish. Everyone should be put on the par, treated equally, and as such, citizenship's rights will be acknowledged for all. That system worked pretty okay, I would say, until essentially the 1970s. I think essentially for a number of reasons. The first one is that until the 1970s, the question of second-generation immigrants wasn't posed. It's only from the 1970s that the French realized that there were, in fact, migrants who had come to work in France. Most of them had settled, and children were born as a result of that. So what was the status of those children? Of course, they were by law French, but as we shall see in a moment, the situation was more complex for some. The second reason is the crisis of the nation-state. Essentially, the nation-state is seen as a sphere of shared belonging, welfare distribution, access to equal rights, and also a sphere of mediation between institutions and citizens. All that, came in a crisis from the 1970s onward. So what happened then is that this integration model, which I label colorblind because it doesn't want to acknowledge, of course, racial backgrounds of his or her citizens, was unable really to address the new socio-political issues in relation to the situation of ethnic minorities in France. In fact, the blindness to the issue of ethnicity didn't allow then French society to recognize the racial divide in France. Well, let's talk briefly about the crisis of the French Republican model. Well, essentially it started, as I said, in the 1970s, but I think debates were essentially reached a peak, a high, if you like, in the 1980s. The paradox I want to state, because that's a paradox, this is a model of integration, a model of citizenship which is, as I said, colorblind, doesn't distinguish between ethnic backgrounds. However, it's a model which, from the 1980s, created, if you like, a situation where, in fact, the official colorblind discourse on integration was progressively replaced by an official discourse on ethnicity and race. So in fact, more and more citizens, foreigners, were defined, were framed, if you like, in the public discourse according to their ethnic background, which is, of course, a deep paradox for a model which is supposed to be colorblind. That shift took place in the 1980s. However, the first years of that decade were quite promising, if you like, for those who believe that, in fact, the issue of race is essential and distinctions ought to be taken into account, essentially due to a political event, the election of a socialist president, the first one under the Fifth Republic, François Mitterrand, who, broadly speaking, was sympathetic to the new anti-racist movements which were developing in France at the time, notably close to the governing party SOS Racisme and also France Plus. Those associations were the first, probably in France, to come up with a kind of new discourse, you know, advocating civic participation of the second generation immigrants who by French law were French, and also, for instance, advocated the right of foreigners to vote in local elections. That was a very short-lived window because by the mid-1980s, another political event or another political the situation politically changed, if you like, with the electoral breakthrough of the National Front. For the first time, from a very marginal party on the extreme right, the party gained at the 1984 European election more than 10% of the share of the vote. So that party, of course, really reshaped very much the terms of the debates on nationality and race in France, notably challenging the loyalty of those second-generation immigrants in France, who, as I said, were by law French, but that party and also sections of the French right started really to question that loyalty. Were they really deeply, genuinely French? I skip that decade to get to the 1990s, where clearly, more and more so, in the public debate, I should also mention, a very important, a turning point probably, yes, 1986, the right came back to power and changed the nationality law, making it more difficult for youngsters born to foreign parents in France, on French soil, to become French. Normally, before that law, at the age of 18, automatically, if you were born on French soil to foreign parents, you received French nationality. That was changed to the situation was different after that. Children had to voluntarily request and make a request to the French authorities to become French. So, just an example, very briefly, of the change of mood in the 1990s. This is an excerpt of a text or of a report written by Haut Conseil à l'Intégration, set up by the then President Jacques Chirac. So it's a very official body in France. And if you read it, I don't have time to really read it out, but it clearly shows that more and more from the 1990s, there is an explicit racial framing, you know, of foreign populations, notably with implicit, veiled, thinly veiled reference to Islam. And always the idea is to compare, you know, those different cultural attitudes or behaviors or beliefs to a standardized Frenchness or French definition of what a French citizen ought to be or how he or how she ought to behave. More conscious republic, again, a very short window where from the late 1990s, the HCI, which I just mentioned, there was a change of mood, a change of tactic or strategy, if you like. For the first time, French authorities recognized that this colorblind model of integration wasn't really working in a multicultural, multi-ethnic France, and it had even become a major obstacle in the way of our goal of integration. That was the statement. That was very much in line with the provisions contained in the EU Amsterdam Treaty, which was adopted by member states at the time. But that was very short-lived because, again, by the noughties, essentially after 2005, where a number of riots took place in urban areas in France, and again in 2007, the theme of integration and nationality was repoliticized. And whenever in France it is repoliticized, that means a swing of the pendulum back to the dangers of what they regard the communautarism, which is the worst thing. Of course, decided that between the general will, la volonté générale, and the sort of different communities, there shouldn't be anything. There shouldn't be any intermediate bodies. So that's what the communautarism and the danger of communautarism is about. Laïcité, I will conclude now. Laïcité, which is the separation of the church and state in France, became a core element of French identity. That led to the law that you probably have heard about, which is a 2004 law banning conspicuous religious signs in school, seen by many commentators, in fact, as a ban on the headscarf in school. So, to conclude, I would say that the colorblind conception of French citizenship is indeed fairly inadequate for the analysis of immigrant integration in France. What's more, the critique of the failure of immigrant integration, that is, you have to conform to a certain standard of Frenchness or definition of French citizenship, has in fact paradoxically justified the racialization of the terms of the debate on integration, on French citizenship. Thank you.